Before the New World Order became a charged phrase whispered in speeches, documentaries, or conspiracy forums, it existed as something far older and more mundane, the recurring human attempt to impose order on chaos. Every civilization that reached a certain scale confronted the same problem: how to stabilize power, trade, security, and legitimacy beyond the lifespan of any one ruler. Empires didn't just conquer territory, they tried to standardize reality. Laws, currencies, calendars, borders, and belief systems were tools for managing complexity. The Roman Empire, for example, was not merely a military project. It was a logistical one. Roads unified commerce. Coinage unified exchange. Roman law unified disputes across cultures that had little in common. Rome's genius wasn't domination, it was administrative coherence. And when that coherence failed, fragmentation followed. This pattern repeated endlessly. The Holy Roman Empire tried to fuse divine authority with territorial governance. The Chinese dynasties built bureaucratic continuity that survived individual emperors. Islamic caliphates connected distant regions through shared legal and commercial frameworks. None of these were new world orders in name, but all were systems of enforced order meant to outlast volatility. The modern idea begins to crystallize much later, after Europe's endless wars forced a realization: unchecked sovereignty produces perpetual conflict. That realization culminated in the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. Often misunderstood as just a diplomatic settlement, Westphalia quietly introduced a revolutionary idea. States recognize each other as sovereign. Borders matter. Internal governance is not a pretext for endless war. This wasn't peace. It was system design. Westphalia didn't eliminate conflict, it contained it. It marked the beginning of international relations as a managed system rather than a theological struggle. For the first time, the world began organizing itself not around empires ordained by God, but around rules agreed upon by power holders. From here, the philosophical groundwork accelerated. Enlightenment thinkers began asking unsettling questions. Could reason replace divine authority? Could law be standardized across cultures? Could trade create peace more reliably than armies? Thinkers like Immanuel Kant imagined federations of states bound by shared rules, predicting that commerce and mutual dependence would gradually make war irrational rather than immoral. This wasn't utopian idealism, it was early systems thinking. Then came the Industrial Revolution. For the first time, production, finance, and logistics scaled faster than politics. Capital flowed across borders faster than armies. Railways ignored feudal boundaries. Markets began behaving like global organisms, while governments remained stubbornly local. This mismatch, global systems versus national authority, is the pressure point that gives rise to every modern New World Order narrative. By the early 20th century, 2 world wars demonstrated that nationalism alone could not manage industrial-scale destruction. In response, leaders openly began using the language of new orders. After World War I, League of Nations was formed to prevent another catastrophe through collective security, standardized diplomacy, and shared norms. It failed, not because the idea was flawed, but because power had not yet agreed to submit itself to constraints. This is the crucial insight often lost in modern discussions. The New World Order is not a single plan. It is a recurring response to systemic breakdown. Every time existing structures prove insufficient to manage technology, population, or economic integration, elites attempt redesign. Sometimes openly, sometimes quietly, sometimes successfully, sometimes catastrophically. Segment 1 ends here at the moment when the desire for order becomes explicit and the world begins experimenting with rule-based global coordination rather than imperial domination. In Segment 2, we'll move into the 20th century and examine how war, finance, and institutional power transform the idea of global order from philosophy into infrastructure. If Segment 1 was about ideas, Segment 2 is about shock. Nothing accelerates global coordination like systemic failure. And no failure in human history was as clarifying as the first half of the 20th century. World War I shattered a comforting illusion that industrial progress naturally produced stability. Instead, it revealed something darker. Modern systems multiplied destruction faster than diplomacy could contain it. Railroads moved troops efficiently. Factories produced weapons endlessly. Finance funded war at a scale monarchies had never imagined. When the war ended, Europe wasn't just exhausted, it was structurally broken. Empires collapsed almost overnight. The Austro-Hungarian Empire dissolved into fragile nation-states. The Ottoman Empire fragmented. Russia imploded into revolution. Suddenly, borders were everywhere, and none of them stable. The response was the first genuine attempt at a managed international order. The League of Nations was not born from idealism alone. It was born from fear that without coordination, modern war would become permanent. The League attempted something radical. Collective security instead of unilateral defense. Arbitration instead of conquest. International norms instead of imperial privilege. But the League suffered from a fatal contradiction. It tried to regulate power without possessing any. The most powerful nations either refused to join or ignored its rulings. Sovereignty still mattered more than stability. When the Great Depression hit, that contradiction exploded. Global trade collapsed. Currencies devalued in panic. Protectionism spread. Economic desperation radicalized populations. And once again, states retreated inward, placing national survival above international cooperation. This inward turn didn't prevent conflict. It weaponized it. World War II was not just another war. It was the proof that uncoordinated global systems were incompatible with industrial civilization. The scale of death, displacement, and economic ruin forced a conclusion that could no longer be avoided. The post-war world would either be governed by rules or destroyed by feedback loops. This time, the response was different. Even before the war ended, planners began designing the next system. In 1944, representatives from 44 nations met at the Bretton Woods Conference. Their goal was explicit: prevent another depression, prevent another global war, and stabilize capitalism itself. Out of Bretton Woods came institutions that still quietly shape the world today. The International Monetary Fund, to manage currency stability and provide emergency liquidity. The World Bank, to finance reconstruction and development. A dollar-centered monetary system anchored, at the time, to gold. This was not world government, but it was something new, rule-based economic coordination above the nation-state. At the same time, political architecture followed. The United Nations replaced the League, this time with enforcement mechanisms, veto powers, and permanent structures designed to reflect real power rather than ideal equality. Critically, these systems did not eliminate hierarchy, they formalized it. Powerful nations gained influence through weighted voting, reserve currencies, and security guarantees. Smaller nations gained access to stability, capital, and legitimacy at the cost of partial autonomy. This trade-off was intentional. Here's where the modern New World Order narrative begins to sharpen. For the first time in history, financial stability depended on international institutions. Currency values were indirectly coordinated. Development paths were shaped by external rules. Sovereignty became conditional rather than absolute. To supporters, this was pragmatic realism. To critics, it looked like a quiet transfer of power away from democratic publics toward technocratic elites. And both interpretations contain truth. The post-war order worked, spectacularly so by historical standards. Global poverty declined. Trade expanded. Wars between major powers disappeared. But it also centralized decision-making in ways that were opaque, insulated, and difficult to challenge. Importantly, this system was never advertised as permanent. It was a stopgap, a stabilization layer meant to buy time. But systems built in crisis have a habit of outliving their original justification. Segment 2 ends here. at the moment when order becomes institutional, when crisis hardens theory into architecture, and when the foundations are laid for both unprecedented stability and enduring suspicion. In Segment 3, we'll examine how the Cold War reshaped this order, splitting the world into competing systems while quietly expanding global coordination beneath the surface. On the surface, the Cold War looked like a clean ideological split. Capitalism versus communism. Markets versus planning. Washington versus Moscow. But beneath the rhetoric and spectacle, something more subtle and more important was happening. The global system was becoming more integrated even as it appeared divided. The Cold War did not dismantle the post-war order built in the 1940s. It locked it in. After World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union emerged as structurally different but functionally similar superpowers. Both required massive industrial output, centralized decision-making, long-term planning, technological dominance, narrative control. The ideological disagreement was real. The architecture of power, however, was converging. In the West, economic coordination deepened through institutions like the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and later the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. These weren't just trade forums, they were mechanisms for aligning national policies with global economic rules. In the East, the Soviet Union constructed its own parallel systems, state planning committees, centralized resource allocation, and satellite state coordination through the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance. Two orders, two narratives, one shared assumption. Complex societies require centralized systems to survive. Security followed the same pattern. The creation of NATO and the Warsaw Pact didn't simply divide the world militarily, they froze it. Borders hardened. Influence zones stabilized. Proxy conflicts replaced direct war. This standoff did something paradoxical. It reduced unpredictability. The threat of mutual destruction imposed discipline on decision-makers. Nuclear weapons made total war irrational. Crisis management became an elite profession. Backchannels mattered more than speeches. Stability, not victory, became the real objective. Meanwhile, something quieter was unfolding. Scientific collaboration crossed ideological lines. Financial models became standardized. Supply chains stretched globally. Even adversaries studied each other's management techniques, logistics, and control systems. By the 1960s and 1970s, the Cold War world had settled into a strange equilibrium. Fierce ideological theater on the surface, deepening systemic similarity underneath. This is where many later New World Order interpretations begin to diverge from reality. The Cold War was not a pause in globalization. It was globalization under constraint. Both blocs learned the same lesson. Control required scale, data, coordination, and bureaucracy. Whether markets or ministries allocated resources mattered less than the fact that allocation itself was becoming abstract, technocratic, and insulated from public input. This insulation had consequences. Democratic publics in the West were told markets were natural and self-correcting, while critical decisions were made by central banks, treaty bodies, and executive institutions. Citizens in the East were told the state represented the people, while planning failures and repression revealed a growing disconnect between rulers and ruled. In both cases, legitimacy was increasingly managed rather than earned. The Cold War also normalized secrecy. Intelligence agencies expanded dramatically. Surveillance technologies improved. Information warfare became routine. The idea that populations could be guided, nudged, or managed for stability became acceptable policy. Not because of malice, but because instability was seen as existential risk. By the late Cold War, a quiet consensus had emerged among elites on both sides. The masses are volatile. Systems must be protected. Order is fragile. When the Soviet Union collapsed, many assumed one order had won. But what actually happened was more interesting and more unsettling. The ideological rivalry ended. The systems remained. Segment 3 ends here, at the moment when opposition dissolves into convergence, when the Cold War reveals itself not as a clash between two futures, but as a training ground for global system management. In Segment 4, we'll examine the post-Cold War moment, when the phrase New World Order finally enters mainstream language, and when coordination shifts from military containment to economic and informational dominance. When the Cold War ended, it didn't feel like the birth of a new system. It felt like relief. The Soviet Union dissolved with surprising speed. Borders opened. Markets rushed in. Ideological certainty evaporated almost overnight. For a brief moment in the early 1990s, it appeared that history itself had reached a conclusion. That feeling was captured explicitly when George H.W. Bush publicly used the phrase, "a new world order," in 1990-1991, describing a post-Cold War world governed by international cooperation, collective security, and rule-based norms. This was the moment the phrase entered mainstream consciousness. Importantly, Bush was not announcing a secret plan. He was describing what elites already believed they were building, a unipolar system where one dominant power underwrote global stability, trade, and security. The United States emerged from the Cold War not just as a military superpower, but as the architect and guarantor of the existing international order. The institutions built after World War II, rather than fading, expanded in reach and authority. This expansion took several forms. First, economic integration accelerated dramatically. The creation of the World Trade Organization in 1995 transformed trade rules from voluntary agreements into enforceable legal obligations. Disputes were no longer settled by diplomacy alone. They were adjudicated through formal panels, binding rulings, and compliance mechanisms. Second, financial liberalization became a policy goal rather than a side effect. Capital controls were dismantled. Currency markets deepened. Financial flows began moving at speeds that made national regulation increasingly reactive rather than proactive. Institutions like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank shifted from post-war reconstruction towards structural adjustment, conditioning loans on policy reforms, privatization, and regulatory alignment. To supporters, this was modernization. To critics, it was coercion disguised as assistance. At the same time, military power changed character. Instead of large-scale wars between peer states, intervention became selective, procedural, and justified through norms, humanitarian protection, democracy promotion, international law. NATO expanded eastward. Peacekeeping missions multiplied. Sanctions replaced invasions as the preferred enforcement tool. This mattered psychologically. For the first time, order enforcement was framed as neutral and technical rather than political. Decisions were presented as inevitabilities of global norms rather than choices made by powerful actors. This framing fueled suspicion. Many populations, especially in post-Soviet states and a global South, experienced the 1990s not as liberation, but as dislocation. State industries collapsed. Inequality surged. Social safety nets eroded. Political sovereignty felt theoretical when economic policy was shaped externally. Here is where New World Order narratives begin to harden. Not because coordination existed, but because agency seemed to disappear. Policies were described as best practices. Market reforms were said to have no alternative. Technocrats replaced ideologues. Central banks gained independence from elected governments. Trade agreements constrained domestic legislation. The system worked macroeconomically, but it felt unaccountable politically. By the late 1990s, cracks were visible. Financial crises in Asia, Russia, and Latin America exposed fragility. Globalization produced winners and losers, but decision-making remained concentrated. Protest movements emerged, Seattle in 1999 being a symbolic turning point, challenging the legitimacy of institutions like the WTO. The dream of a frictionless global order was already fading. Segment 4 ends at this hinge moment, when the New World Order is no longer a future promise, but lived reality, uneven, efficient, and increasingly questioned. In Segment 5, we'll explore how globalization, digital networks, and financialization deepen coordination while simultaneously eroding trust, laying the groundwork for today's backlash and alternative narratives. By the early 2000s, the architecture of global order was no longer theoretical or emerging, it was operational. Supply chains spanned continents. Capital moved continuously across borders. Decisions made in one financial center could reshape labor markets thousands of miles away within days. The world wasn't just connected, it was interdependent. And that interdependence changed where power lived. Unlike earlier empires, this order was not anchored primarily in territory or armies. It was anchored in flows. Financial flows, information flows, commodity flows, data flows. Institutions mattered, but markets increasingly mattered more. The center of gravity shifted away from visible governance toward systems that appeared automatic. This is where the modern sense of unease begins to intensify. Financialization transformed capitalism itself. Instead of profits emerging mainly from production, they increasingly emerged from leverage, speculation, and abstraction. Complex instruments, derivatives, securitized debt, algorithmic trading allowed risk to be sliced, redistributed, and disguised. The system became efficient. It also became opaque. Central banks gained unprecedented influence, not through coercion, but through liquidity. Interest rates, asset purchases, and signaling began shaping entire economies without legislative debate. Institutions like the Bank for International Settlements quietly coordinated standards, stress tests, and risk frameworks among monetary authorities. To insiders, this was prudence. To outsiders, it looked like unelected governance by spreadsheet. At the same time, globalization reshaped labor and identity. Manufacturing migrated to lower-cost regions. Knowledge work clustered in global cities. National economies fractured internally. Some regions integrated seamlessly into global markets, others hollowed out. The result wasn't just inequality, it was divergence of lived reality. Two people in the same country could now inhabit different economic systems. Digital networks accelerated this divide. The internet initially appeared to decentralize power. Information was free. Voices multiplied. Borders weakened. But scale quickly reasserted itself. Platforms consolidated. Network effects created winners that dwarfed nation-states in reach. Data, once incidental, became the most valuable resource in the system. Crucially, data flowed where laws did not. This produced a new form of authority, influence without formal responsibility. Corporations shaped behavior, markets, and discourse while remaining legally fragmented across jurisdictions. Regulation lagged. Governance blurred. For many observers, this felt like the emergence of a shadow layer, coordination without consent. Then came the shock that clarified everything. The 2008 global financial crisis revealed that the system was neither self-correcting nor morally neutral. Risk had been privatized. Losses were socialized. Banks deemed too big to fail were rescued not because they were virtuous, but because their collapse threatened systemic survival. This moment permanently altered public perception. Governments that preached market discipline intervened massively. Trillions were created to stabilize financial institutions. Ordinary citizens absorbed unemployment, austerity, and lost wealth. The message, intended or not, was clear. Some systems must be saved, regardless of democratic preference. This was not conspiracy. It was triage. But triage feels indistinguishable from favoritism when transparency is low and pain is uneven. After 2008, faith in neutrality collapsed. Globalization no longer felt inevitable, it felt engineered. Expertise no longer felt impartial, it felt aligned. The phrase New World Order stopped meaning abstract coordination and began meaning a system that protects itself first. Importantly, this perception did not require secret meetings or unified intent. It emerged organically from incentives, feedback loops, and crisis management logic. Complex systems once built prioritize their own continuity. Segment 5 ends here, at the point where efficiency and legitimacy diverge, where coordination deepens but trust collapses, and where the idea of a new world order shifts from academic analysis into popular suspicion. In Segment 6, we'll examine how this trust gap fuels populism, nationalism, and alternative power centers, and why resistance to global order often strengthens the very systems it opposes. By the mid-2010s, the backlash was no longer subtle. It arrived through elections, referendums, protests, and rhetoric that shared a common theme: the system no longer represents us. Populist movements surged across very different cultures and political traditions, yet they spoke an eerily similar language. They targeted global elites, technocrats, international institutions, trade agreements, central banks, unaccountable power. From the outside, these movements looked chaotic and contradictory. From the inside, they felt corrective, an attempt to reassert human agency over abstract systems. Events like the United Kingdom's vote to leave the European Union and the election of Donald Trump were often framed as nationalist ruptures. But structurally, they were reactions to the same underlying condition. Decision-making had drifted too far from lived experience. Globalization had optimized for scale and efficiency. Politics, however, still operated on identity, trust, and proximity. This mismatch created a legitimacy vacuum. Populism filled that vacuum not with new systems, but with narratives of restoration. Take back control, reclaim sovereignty, make institutions answerable again. The appeal was emotional, not technical, because the problem felt emotional: invisibility, precarity, loss of voice. But here is the paradox. Most populist movements did not, and could not, dismantle global systems. Supply chains, capital markets, energy networks, and digital platforms were already too interwoven. Even leaders elected on anti-globalization platforms quickly discovered the same constraint their predecessors faced. Exit is harder than critique. Trade wars required tariffs, but also negotiations. Immigration crackdowns required data sharing and surveillance. Currency sovereignty required coordination with markets. Attempts to go it alone often increased dependence on the very systems being criticized. Resistance, unintentionally, tightened the system. National governments expanded executive power to manage volatility. Borders became more surveilled. Financial controls became more sophisticated. Information ecosystems hardened into polarized bubbles. Emergency powers normalized. The language was anti-globalist. The outcomes were more centralized, not less. This is one of the least discussed dynamics in New World Order debates. Backlash rarely destroys systems, it reshapes their interfaces. Populism also fractured consensus. Where earlier global coordination relied on elite agreement and public apathy, the new era required narrative management. Information warfare intensified. Trust became a strategic resource. Platforms became battlegrounds. The distinction between domestic politics and global competition blurred. Meanwhile, global institutions adapted. The International Monetary Fund reframed its language around inequality and resilience. Central banks adopted forward guidance and transparency rituals. Trade agreements grew more complex, embedding labor, environmental, and data rules to restore legitimacy. The system learned, but slowly and defensively. For many citizens, this adaptation looked cosmetic. Power still felt distant. Crises still produced asymmetrical pain. The idea of a coordinated global order no longer sounded like stability. It sounded like entrenchment. This is the moment when New World Order narratives bifurcate. One path interprets events as systemic stress, institutions struggling to evolve fast enough to maintain consent. The other interprets them as confirmation, proof that elites respond to revolt by tightening control rather than surrendering it. Both readings coexist. Both draw from real evidence. Segment 6 ends here, at the point where opposition becomes structural, where distrust itself becomes a governing condition, and where the effort to escape global order paradoxically reinforces the need for coordination. In Segment 7, we'll turn to the present decade and examine how crisis stacking, pandemics, climate stress, technological acceleration, has normalized emergency governance and pushed the New World Order debate into new territory altogether. If earlier eras built global order through war or markets, the current era is building it through overlapping emergencies. By the 2020s, crises no longer arrived one at a time. They stacked. A global pandemic, supply chain breakdowns, energy shocks, accelerating climate stress, geopolitical realignment, rapid AI and automation advances. Each event alone might have been manageable. Together, they produced a new governing logic. Exception is no longer temporary. The COVID-19 pandemic is the clearest example. Within weeks, governments across the world adopted policies once considered unthinkable. Border closures, lockdowns, emergency spending, centralized health mandates, mass data collection. Coordination occurred at unprecedented speed through institutions like the World Health Organization, national public health agencies, and scientific networks. Supporters saw necessity. Critics saw rehearsal. What mattered structurally was not the intent, but the precedent. Emergency powers worked. Centralized decision-making was fast. Public resistance was uneven and fragmented. Once activated, these tools didn't disappear. They were refined. The same pattern appeared elsewhere. Climate policy began shifting from aspiration to enforcement. Agreements like the Paris Agreement increasingly translated into carbon pricing, reporting requirements, and regulatory harmonization. Financial institutions began integrating climate risk into lending and investment criteria, not as ideology, but as systemic risk management. Energy grids, food systems, and insurance markets followed. Again, coordination looked technical. Again, it felt political. At the same time, supply chain disruptions exposed the fragility of hyper-optimization. Governments began mapping critical dependencies, semiconductors, rare earths, pharmaceuticals. Industrial policy returned. Strategic stockpiles expanded. Trade neutrality gave way to resilience logic. This was not deglobalization. It was managed globalization. Digital infrastructure deepened this trend. Health passes, digital IDs, payment systems, and surveillance tools expanded under emergency justification. Even when voluntary, they normalized persistent verification. Identity, access, and compliance increasingly flowed through interoperable systems rather than paper institutions. To planners, this was modernization. To skeptics, it looked like soft consolidation. The crucial shift here is psychological. In earlier decades, global coordination was justified as prosperity enhancing. In the 2020s, it is justified as catastrophe avoiding. The argument is no longer this will make things better, but without this, things will collapse. That framing is powerful and difficult to challenge democratically. Who votes against safety? Who campaigns for fragility? As a result, decision-making moves faster than deliberation. Expertise outruns consent. Public debate trails implementation. Even well-intentioned governance begins to feel imposed rather than chosen. This is fertile ground for New World Order interpretations. Not because there is a single command center, but because emergency logic converges power naturally. When systems face existential risk, they centralize, standardize, and override local variation. History shows this repeatedly. What's new is the scale and persistence. The emergencies no longer end. Segment 7 ends here, at the threshold of a world where crisis is continuous, coordination is reflexive, and the line between protection and control becomes increasingly difficult to draw. In Segment 8, we'll explore how emerging technologies, AI, surveillance, digital money, and algorithmic governance are transforming global order from something negotiated by humans into something enforced by systems. If earlier forms of global order relied on institutions, laws, and elites, the emerging form relies on something quieter and more powerful: systems that execute policy automatically. This is not science fiction. It is already underway. As societies scale beyond human manageability, governance increasingly migrates from debate to design. Rules are no longer enforced primarily by people. They are embedded into code, protocols, and infrastructures. Once implemented, they operate continuously, without emotion, discretion, or pause. This is the most profound shift in the idea of world order so far. Artificial intelligence plays a central role, not as a conscious authority, but as an optimizer. Machine learning systems are now used to detect fraud and financial crime, allocate credit and insurance risk, moderate speech and visibility, predict supply chain failures, prioritize law enforcement and compliance, model climate, epidemiological, and economic scenarios. Crucially, these systems do not argue. They rank, filter, and trigger. When governments and institutions rely on AI-driven models, policy becomes probabilistic rather than ideological. Decisions are justified by outputs, risk scores, forecasts, confidence intervals, rather than values. Accountability becomes diffuse. No single actor decides, yet outcomes are binding. This is governance without authorship. Surveillance infrastructure amplifies this effect. Cameras, sensors, biometric systems, and data exhaust from everyday life feed continuous streams into analytical platforms. Unlike past surveillance, this is not episodic, it is ambient. It does not need to watch everyone all the time. It only needs to be there. Institutions frame this as efficiency and safety. Critics experience it as permanent visibility. At the monetary layer, the same logic is emerging. Central banks across the world are researching and piloting digital currencies, including central bank digital currency. Unlike cash, these systems can be programmable, embedding rules directly into money itself. Expiration dates, spending constraints, compliance checks, and real-time monitoring become technically possible. Whether fully implemented or not, the direction is clear. Policy migrates into infrastructure. This represents a qualitative change. In older systems, power required enforcement after the fact. In system-based governance, non-compliance is preempted. You don't break the rule, the system simply doesn't allow the action. Global coordination benefits enormously from this. Standards become interoperable. Enforcement becomes consistent. Risk is reduced. Crisis response accelerates. From a planner's perspective, this is a dream. Fewer human bottlenecks, fewer political delays, fewer surprises. But it comes with a cost rarely addressed directly. Exit becomes difficult. When governance is embedded in code, opting out means exclusion from the system itself: payments, travel, platforms, markets. Sovereignty shifts from the right to decide to the ability to participate. This is where New World Order narratives intensify again. Not because technology is malicious, but because it removes friction, and friction is where dissent traditionally lived. Bureaucracy could be challenged. Officials could be persuaded. Laws could be changed. Systems are harder to argue with. Importantly, none of this requires a unified global authority. Interoperability alone produces convergence. If financial systems, identity systems, data standards, and regulatory frameworks must communicate across borders, they naturally harmonize. Local variation becomes expensive. Exceptions become risks. Standardization becomes the path of least resistance. Order emerges without declaration. Segment 8 ends here, at the moment when governance begins shifting from negotiated agreement to automated execution, and when the idea of a new world order stops being about who rules and starts being about how systems decide. In Segment 9, we'll examine whether this trajectory is inevitable, or whether fragmentation, multipolarity, and resistance could still reshape global order in unexpected ways. At this stage of the story, the idea of a single, unified New World Order begins to break down. not because coordination has failed, but because it is no longer monopolized. The unipolar moment that followed the Cold War has ended. Power is diffusing across regions, systems, and standards. What's emerging is not chaos, but multipolar order, multiple centers of gravity operating within overlapping global frameworks. This matters deeply for how the future unfolds. Economically and technologically, alternative ecosystems are forming. Payment systems, supply chains, energy strategies, and digital platforms increasingly diverge by region. Competing standards emerge around data governance, privacy, surveillance, and platform control. Interoperability remains, but it is selective rather than universal. Coordination persists, but alignment fractures. Geopolitically, institutions once assumed neutral are now contested. Trade rules become strategic. Sanctions become normalized tools of statecraft. Technology access becomes conditional. Even scientific collaboration becomes politicized. This is not a retreat from globalization. It is fragmented globalization. At the same time, resistance to centralized systems is becoming more sophisticated. Early backlash relied on protest and rhetoric. New forms of resistance rely on parallel systems, alternative currencies and payment rails, decentralized platforms and protocols, localized production and resilience strategies, jurisdictional arbitrage, choosing where to live, work, and operate. These efforts do not overthrow global order. They route around it. Importantly, they are not necessarily anti-coordination. Many adopt their own rules, standards, and governance mechanisms, sometimes more rigid than the systems they criticize. The desire is not for disorder, but for choice among orders. This reveals a key misunderstanding in classic New World Order thinking. The real tension is not between global order and freedom. It is between singular order and plural order. People tolerate rules when they have exit options. They resist when rules feel inescapable. Multipolarity introduces exit again, but unevenly. Large states gain leverage by shaping regional blocs. Smaller states hedge by diversifying partnerships. Individuals with capital and mobility gain optionality. Those without remain embedded in systems they cannot influence. This uneven distribution of exit is where instability lives. Meanwhile, global risks do not respect fragmentation. Climate change, pandemics, cyber threats, financial contagion, and AI misalignment all demand coordination at scale. No regional system can manage them alone. Even rival powers share a baseline interest in systemic continuity. This creates a structural trap. Fragmentation increases resilience against domination, but reduces capacity for collective response. Convergence increases stability, but erodes perceived autonomy. Neither extreme is sustainable. This is why the future does not look like a single new world order, or its collapse, but like competing orders forced to interoperate under stress. The system becomes less elegant, more redundant, more political, more brittle in some places, more resilient in others. Segment 9 ends here, at the crossroads between consolidation and divergence, where no single actor controls the trajectory, but where systemic pressures continue to push toward coordination regardless of ideology. In Segment 10, we'll close by stepping back, asking whether the New World Order is best understood as a conspiracy, a project, or something more unsettling, an emergent property of complex civilization itself. After tracing the arc, from empires to institutions, from globalization to algorithms, the idea of a single, deliberate new world order begins to dissolve. Not because coordination is imaginary, not because power is evenly distributed, but because the evidence points somewhere less dramatic and more unsettling. What we are living inside is not a plan. It is a process. Throughout history, whenever human systems reach a certain scale, complexity outpaces intuition. At that point, societies stop governing through values alone and begin governing through structures designed to prevent collapse. Rules harden. Authority migrates upward. Decision-making narrows. Feedback loops dominate intent. This is not new. What is new is density. More people, more interdependence, more speed, more risk concentration. Under these conditions, coordination is not optional, is structural gravity. Every major institution examined across these segments, the United Nations, financial bodies, trade regimes, security alliances, data standards, emergency frameworks, emerged not from secret consensus, but from repeated failures of looser systems. Each layer was added after a crisis, justified as temporary, and retained because removing it felt dangerous. The result looks intentional from the outside because path dependence produces coherence. No single actor controls the whole, but every actor reinforces the same constraints. This is why New World Order narratives persist even when specific claims fail scrutiny. They are responding to something real, but misidentifying its nature. Power today is less about command and more about architecture. Who sets standards? Who defines risk? Who designs defaults? Who controls interoperability? These decisions shape outcomes without ever issuing orders. From inside the system, this feels like responsibility. From outside, it feels like inevitability. Neither perspective is wrong. The unsettling truth is that global order is becoming post-ideological. It does not care whether it is loved. It cares whether it functions. Legitimacy is no longer its primary fuel. Continuity is. That does not mean resistance is futile. It means resistance must evolve. The meaningful questions going forward are not, is there a new world order? Who is behind it? But rather, where is choice still possible? Where can rules be reshaped before they become infrastructure? How do we preserve pluralism inside systems that reward uniformity? Because once governance migrates fully into code, protocols, and automated enforcement, politics doesn't disappear. It just becomes harder to see and harder to change. In that sense, the New World Order is not coming. It is already here not as a regime, but as a condition of living inside a civilization that has outgrown its ability to consciously steer itself. The final irony is this. The most dangerous myth is not that a hidden group controls the world. It's that no one does, and the systems keep moving anyway. That is where the real tension of the modern era lies.